So let's talk about skeletal cartilage. Cartilage is found all over the body. Your skeleton isn't just made of bones, right? You do have cartilage around joints and places of bony attachment. So for example, you can see there's some cartilage in the ends of long bones. You have really firm cartilage some places, like in your knees, your pubic symphysis, along your spinal column. Cartilage can connects your ribs to your sternum. You also have cartilage a few other semi-random places. You've got some that makes up most of the structure of your nose. If you pinch the tip of your nose and wiggle it back and forth, you'll see that it moves, right? Side to side. Now, pinch a little further up and it still moves. Pinch a little further up and it still moves. Pinch a little further up, like if you wear glasses, where your glasses will sit, and you notice that it doesn't move anymore. All the stuff that'll move is cartilage. You can feel that most of the bridge of your nose is cartilage. And you also have some cartilage in your external ear, and it's not shown here, but in your epiglottis, the flap that covers your larynx when you swallow so food doesn't go into your lungs. Oh, here, you can see that epiglottis right there. You can also see that you have some other structures that are fully formed by cartilage. For example, the rest of the larynx itself is mostly made up of cartilage. And the rings of the trachea are made up of cartilage as well. Cartilage isn't as hard and as rigid as bone, but it is still fairly robust. It bends, but not super easily. It tends to spring back to shape. So if you think about the structure of your trachea, your windpipe, right? What's it have to do? It has to be able to allow air to come in and go out unobstructed. And you also have to be able, it's a tube that goes through your neck, right? So you have to be able to move your neck around without breaking it or pinching it off. Cartilage with connective tissue connecting each ring of the cartilage is a really great solution because the cartilage is rigid enough that it'll hold that tube open. It's not going to collapse upon itself like if it was just a tube of muscle. And it can bend between those rings quite nicely. It can bend this way easily and that way easily and forward and back. Your skeletal cartilage is mostly water. Some of it's more fibrous than others. There's 3 types we'll talk about soon. The water is bound up almost exclusively in ground substance. So you remember from the connective tissue lecture, the ground substance is that very water-loving humectant kind of a material. It's protein, sugary, and it is the sort of thick gel-like substrate that connective tissue all sits in. And that's basically what's filling up the cartilage. You do have a fibrous content. Some have more than others. And some have different types of fibers than others. Cartilage tissue features chondrocytes in lacunae. Think of that as an analogy to osteocytes, which also have lacunae. If they both have similar terminology, you might think that they're related, okay? And histologically, it looks fairly similar. This is a bit of a blown up image, but I hope you can appreciate that you have cells in a little lacunae, a cell in sort of a space, a cell in sort of a space, chondrocytes in lacunae. Cartilage provides resiliency, a scaffolding into which ossification may happen. Cartilage doesn't always become bone, but it can provide a scaffolding along which bone can be created. And importantly, cartilage is avascular. The cartilage tissue itself is avascular and not innervated. Sorry, that flipped before I could make that note. So if cartilage tissue itself is avascular, and it has no blood vessels, and it has no nerves of its own, how do those cells live? You probably had a similar question when you were thinking about epithelium, right? Because that doesn't have its own direct blood supply either. And what was the case with epithelium? You had a connective tissue membrane just deep to the epithelial tissue, so that the blood vessels could be embedded in that connective tissue, and the nutrients can percolate up through the layers of epithelium. Waste can percolate back down to the bloodstream. Gases can be exchanged. Excuse me. But all that blood vessel, all those blood vessels, that whole blood supply is bound up in the connective tissue. This ultimately limits how thick epithelium can be, right? Because as nutrients diffuse up away from the bloodstream and the connective tissue superficially through all those different layers, you know, the deepest layers, those first layers of skin cells, for example, are going to gobble up whatever they need. The next layer has a little bit less available. The next layer up has a little less available. And eventually you're not really going to be able to have enough to support life, nor are they going to be able to offload their wastes enough to be able to survive. You can't just drown in your own waste. So cartilage has perichondrium, and perichondrium is a dense connective tissue covering cartilage. Cartilage and bone kind of go hand in hand, right? So what's a similar term to perichondrium that bone has? Periosteum. Very similar types of tissues. If you recall, periosteum has two layers, a fibrous layer and a cellular layer. The cellular layer is like bone stem cells and stuff like that. And then the fibrous layer is dense, irregular connective tissue. I hope by now you're realizing that a lot of these sac-like or structural membranes end up being dense, irregular connective tissue. Many, not all. Perichondrium is made of dense, irregular, it's not written, but there we go, connective tissue, and that covers the cartilage. So if you think of cartilage, you have like a little sac, okay? The inside is cartilage, the cartilage tissue itself, and the outside sac that holds all the cartilage in is dense, irregular connective tissue. Please remember that you can't use these abbreviations on exams and practicals. You need to at least spell out dense, irregular, but I guess the CT I would be fine with. So the cartilage tissue proper is in the middle, dense irregular connective tissue is on the outside. The dense irregular connective tissue, like basically all other kinds of connective tissue for the most part, has nerves, it has blood vessels. So just like with epithelium, nutrients and gases can diffuse from that dense irregular connective tissue through the cartilage itself. Now, because it can only go so far before cells end up getting starved, this effectively limits the size of and the shape, and it restricts the shape of any given pad of cartilage. So if you think about it, let's pretend that we have cartilage as a sphere, and the red line I just drew is the dense irregular connective tissue. So nutrients can diffuse down, but only so far. Right, and you get less and less and less. And then you end up with a middle that can't really live. You're not just going to have sort of a hollow middle to a tissue. You don't really keep vacuums in the body anywhere. So what you're going to end up with is cartilage that maybe has the same volume, but is shaped differently. So the nutrients from the bloodstream and the wastes from the cells can permeate the whole way through. Okay? So the size is limited. If you have a pad like this and it's super, super huge or thick, that's not going to work either, right? The shape is a factor, and the overall size and volume is a factor too. Let me erase that. The perichondrium can also lay down new layers of matrix to create larger cartilage pads. You can have appositional growth. Appositional growth is long ways growth, okay, or sorry, width ways growth. If for some reason you need to have more cartilage in a given spot, you can lay down more fibrous matrix and fill that space a little bit. Its ability to do that is limited, both in terms of just properties inherent to the tissue and age and stuff like that, but you can grow cartilage by laying down new matrix. This concept is going to be something you want to keep in the back of your mind when you're thinking about bone growth and development. Interstitial growth, when you see that term, that refers to growth from chondrocytes. So chondrocytes can also lay down matrix and fibers, right? Not just the perichondrium. The chondrocytes can also lay it down, and that's called interstitial growth. As I alluded to in a previous slide, there are 3 types of cartilage. Hopefully you remember these from our tissue lectures. Fibrocartilage, right? That one had those thick bundles that looked side to side. They almost looked like scribbly, kind of. And then you would have cells arranged between those thick bands, right? Refer back to the tissues lecture if you want to see a picture of that again. So thick parallel rows of chondrocytes, those are the cells in there. Thick bundles of collagen fibers, those are the big, thick, scribbly lines. They're tough and resilient, but pretty compressible. So you're going to find fibrocartilage in places where you don't necessarily want something rigid. You don't want bone there, because the bone will break too easily. Fibrocartilage will be found at a place that it takes a lot of force from impact, or can take a lot of force from impact, or mechanical stressors in general. But bone's too brittle. So with fibrocartilage, because you have this arrangement with thick bundles and nice tightly lined up rows of cells, you can squish it down a little bit that way, and it can take that impact, absorb and diffuse that force, and then bounce back to shape when it's done taking that force. But it's not going to splay too far in either way, and it is a very, very dense tissue. It can take a lot of abuse before anything bad happens to it. So the menisci of your knee, at the top of your tibial tuberosity. This is a very crude drawing of the tibia. And here's the bottom of the fibula, or the femur. You will find 2 like half moon pads right here that the femur basically rests on, or at least the articular cartilage of the distal femur rests on. Your knees take a ton of force. They take all the weight of your whole upper body, just in a normal day-to-day standing basis, plus extra weight basically every time you take a step walking, every time you jump, every time you run. You don't want to wear down your tibia, you don't want to wear down your femur, so you'll pad it with articular cartilage and these nice tough pads of meniscus on the tibia to keep the tibia from wearing down. Your intervertebral discs are also made primarily of fibrocartilage, or at least the outside ring of it is. So if you're looking from a top-down view of a intervertebral disc, you'll find it has a sort of a donut-y arrangement where you've got, and we'll talk more about the proper terms and stuff for this later, kind of a squidgy middle that can really diffuse a lot of force. And then you have this tough fibrocartilage ring around the outside that can take compression, okay, and prevent your vertebrae from grinding up against each other with every step. Remember, as bipeds, our spines take a lot more abuse with every step that we take than a quadruped, because it's aligned perpendicular to gravity as opposed to parallel with gravity. Elastic cartilage, you don't have a ton of. It's mostly found in the external ear, so the pinna of your ear. You know, your earlobe, where people most commonly wear earrings, the dangly down part of your ear. The rest of it is the pinna, and that's mostly elastic cartilage. If you bend around the bottom, the lobe, you feel how it just feels like a flap of skin. It's super loosey-goosey. And then towards the top, there's more resistance. It's harder to fold. It bounces back more quickly. That's elastic cartilage. And your epiglottis is also made of elastic cartilage. That's the flap that covers your windpipe whenever you swallow your trachea. Elastic cartilage is very, very, very stretchy. The fibers are visible via a light microscope, and they tend to have this sort of wispy, sort of a look to them. Take a look back at your tissue slides for an image of that. Finally, last but not least, hyaline cartilage. Overwhelmingly, this is the most abundant type of cartilage in your body. If you're sitting down for a test and I ask you what kind of cartilage something is, and you think, crap, I don't know what this is, guess hyaline. There's like an 85% chance that it's right. It's by far the most common cartilage in your body. In this case, so you had those clear fibers of collagen in fiber cartilage, and you also have clear wisps of elastic cartilage, elastic tissue, elastic fibers in elastic cartilage. Hyaline cartilage, you don't see any of those fibers when you're looking at a microscope slide. And it's not because they don't exist, it's just instead of being arranged into tight bundles, it's very evenly distributed. Now, when these sections are stained, the fibers take up a lot of that dye. And since the fibers are taking up dye and they're really evenly distributed throughout the whole cartilage, the dye takes really evenly and looks very silky and smooth. In this case, your chondrocytes are fairly spherical. Nothing's ever perfect, but they're fairly spherical. And you find hyaline cartilage, like I said, most places in your body. Articular cartilage, which lines the ends of bones at joints. Costal cartilage. Costal refers to ribs. So this is the cartilage in your ribs that connect the rib bones to your sternum. Your ribs themselves do directly articulate with your spine. They don't directly articulate with your sternum. You have a line of cartilage that connects the two. And that's useful, right? Cartilage is a little bit flexible. So that helps facilitate you being able to take in deep breaths and to expel air fairly quickly. Respiratory cartilage. Respiratory refers to lungs. More specifically, we're thinking typically about the trachea, the tracheal rings. If you looked down that tube of the trachea, so that's the opening of the trachea, let's say that red represents the connective tissue and epithelium and stuff on the inside of the trachea. Your cartilage surrounds it. This is anterior. Almost the whole way around, just not the back. It has a C-shaped appearance. So it can bend forward because there's discrete rings, right? You can bend easily side to side. The cartilage helps keep it open. If this were just a long muscular tube with epithelium lining it, it would collapse down on itself whenever it wasn't being actively filled with something. Air isn't enough to keep it open. The cartilage keeps it open despite not having anything in it. And the back, believe it or not, is actually mostly a kind of smooth muscle called the trachealis. You don't need to know that part, but the trachealis can help constrict the airway by contracting down onto itself. It can pull the ends of that C shape in towards one another. And it also provides a flexible backboard. Because see why, if this is, there's your ring again, there's your trachealis muscle. What's behind the trachea? You've got the esophagus, which again is collapsed down onto itself when it's not being filled with food. But then if occasionally you do swallow food and your esophagus has to balloon out to accommodate that piece of food, right? That bolus of food. Now, if your cartilage or if your trachea was cartilage the whole way around, what would happen? The cartilage is firm enough, it's not going to bend just when you take a bite of a sandwich. Sandwich is squidgy, right? Once you've chewed it anyway. You'd be much more prone to choking because you'd have all of those hard bumps that the food would effectively be rubbing up against, because the esophagus is really up against the back of that trachea. So that trachealis muscle here and the C-shaped appearance of the respiratory cartilage makes it so that you can constrict and expand the width of the airway to accommodate more or less airflow. And also, it helps the trachea accommodate food going down the esophagus behind it. Erase that. Nasal cartilage, you felt that before, that's your nose. And check it out. The entire fetal skeleton starts off as hyaline cartilage. Every bone in your body at one point was cartilage. And the cartilage was slowly filled in with bony material. It was slowly ossified as you increased in gestational age, as you got older in the womb, and as you got older outside of the womb, too, when you're children. Remember that when we're talking about growth and development, because you'll find, and when you think about bone histology, because you'll find that the arrangement of cartilage, hyaline cartilage specifically, is really quite similar to that of bone. You have chondrocytes in lacunae, just like osteocytes in lacunae. You have a general sort of collagen-y matrix on the inside between the cells. You have that in bone too, right? Bone tissue is collagen, the osteoid, with hydroxyapatite impregnated onto those osteoid fibers to make it rigid. Here's your collagen fibers right here that your chondrocytes were already making. You have a capsule around it of dense irregular connective tissue. And guess what? Your bones do too. This is all a very, very, very similar arrangement overall. And when bones, super cartoony bone for a second, because I can't really draw otherwise, when your bones grow lengthwise, your long bones, when you're a kid, you're going to find out that there's some cartilage that's left over that can grow and then get filled in, and then grow some more and then get filled in with bone to help your bone get longer.